Hey guys, tonight we begin with the curious, quiet and firelit world of the earliest humans, the cavemen, the forgotten rhythm of every ancient day, a life where survival, storytelling, and stillness could all happen around the same flickering flame. It wasn't just a time of grunting and stone tools, it was where danger, discovery, laughter, cold nights, and community lived side by side beneath the open sky and flickering stars. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before we carved homes into stone or painted tales on cave walls, the world was vast and quiet, untouched by modern time. Our earliest ancestors did not live with noise or rush, but with the slow rhythms of the earth itself. They wandered through forests older than any written word, guided not by maps or signs but by instinct, the soft whisper of leaves, the distant sound of moving water, the scent of animals long past. In those days, the sun dictated all. They rose with its light and slept with its fading warmth. There were no cities. No ticking clocks. No glowing screens. Life was circular, like the moon. They lived day to day, sometimes hour to hour, ruled by hunger, weather, and the stars above. Mornings did not begin with alarms but with the slow waking of bodies huddled close for warmth, curled in the shallow hollows of caves or beneath makeshift shelters of branches and hide. The fire, if it survived the night, glowed low and orange, and they would poke gently at its embers, breathing it back to life before stepping into the misty air. Their first thoughts were not of ambition or duty, but of simple tasks: gather wood, find food, keep the children safe, avoid the predators. For many, the day began with walking, long, wandering walks, often with no clear destination. They moved slowly through tall grasses and between trees, pausing often to examine the tracks of deer or to pull berries from a bush. These early humans were not aimless, but they moved in loops and patterns born from generations of quiet observation. They knew which stream held fish, which stone sheltered snakes, and which tree bore fruit in late summer. They walked barefoot or in crude coverings of hide, feeling the earth beneath them in a way we cannot. Their days were filled with small discoveries: a better stick for digging, a smooth stone perfect for cracking nuts, the flicker of movement in the distance that meant prey or predator. Each discovery was shared, not with grand words or speeches, but with gestures, glances, and soft murmurs in a language half-formed, shaped more by emotion and sound than grammar. Food was not guaranteed. Sometimes the group went to bed with full bellies. Other times, they gnawed on roots and bitter leaves and drank deeply from cool streams to trick their hunger into quieting. They scavenged more than they hunted. A half-eaten carcass left behind by lions could mean survival. Meat was a gift, and when they had it, they treated it with reverence. Cooking, when possible, was a slow and careful act. They gathered around the fire, and smoke curled into the dusk as they turned meat on sticks or roasted tubers in the embers. They didn't dine alone. Meals were shared, and silence around food was often broken by soft conversation, laughter, or the telling of stories, true or imagined. These stories weren't written down, but they lived in the minds of those who heard them. The story of the great bear that almost took the child. The story of the old man who walked into the mountain and never returned. These tales stitched the people together, wrapping their lives in meaning far beyond the practical. Children were not taught in classrooms but by presence and imitation. They watched the adults closely, learned by doing. Their toys were bones, feathers, stones. Their games imitated the rituals of their tribe: pretend hunts, races through the underbrush, the careful balancing of pebbles. They played beneath the open sky, under the watchful eyes of mothers, fathers, aunts, and elders. There was no separation between education and life. Everything they did taught them something. Even boredom had purpose. It allowed their minds to wander, to imagine, to observe. The elderly were not cast aside but listened to. Their years were a source of wisdom. They remembered harsh winters, strange illnesses, and paths now overgrown. Their advice, given quietly, often saved lives. In the slow hours of afternoon, when the heat or cold made activity difficult, the group rested. Some sharpened tools, long flakes of stone shaped into blades. Others tended to skins, scraping and softening them into clothes and bedding. Some simply sat, looking out at the horizon, thinking thoughts they couldn't yet explain. Evening arrived gradually. The fire was stoked again, and as shadows lengthened, the day's final tasks were done. Water was gathered. The area checked for signs of nearby predators. Children were called closer. As darkness fell, the cave or shelter became a glowing island in a sea of blackness. Beyond the fire's reach, the night belonged to others, owls, wolves, rustling things. But within its glow, there was safety. And story. And sleep. Before bed, some painted. Deep within the caves, in spaces untouched by light, hands painted outlines on walls. Horses, deer, mysterious figures with antlers or wings. No one knows exactly why they painted, but perhaps it was the first attempt at memory. To say, we were here. We saw these things. We mattered. The act of painting was quiet, careful, spiritual. Pigments made from ash, ochre, and berry juice were applied with fingers, sticks, or primitive brushes. They painted not for others, but for themselves, or perhaps for spirits, or gods, or children not yet born. As sleep approached, they curled close together, wrapped in furs or pressed against stone. There were no beds, no pillows, just the hard earth softened by moss or leaves. And yet, they slept, lightly, always alert to sound, but deeply enough to dream. They dreamed of hunts and storms and lost loved ones. Their dreams were stitched from the world around them, the fire's glow dancing across the walls, the occasional howl in the distance. In their dreams, they might have spoken to the dead, or to animals, or to gods made of stars. The boundaries between life and dream, day and night, were thin in those times. And as the fire burned low and the group breathed in slow unison, the earth turned quietly beneath them, and another day faded into memory. Sometimes the most boring parts of history are the truest. Our ancestors didn't spend every moment discovering fire or inventing tools. Most of their time was spent waiting, walking, eating, mending, listening. The pace of their lives was measured not in tasks completed but in moments survived. The drama of history, the inventions, the extinctions, the migrations, happened slowly, over hundreds of years. But in the day-to-day, it was quiet. Soft. Almost sleepy. And that is what made it sacred. Even in its slowness, their life was full, of meaning, of danger, of comfort, and of each other. They were not savages. They were not dumb. They were simply, early. And in their simplicity, they held a kind of peace we rarely feel now. So tonight, as you rest, let yourself drift back to that ancient rhythm. Picture the stars as they saw them, unpolluted, endless, and bright. Imagine the feel of cool dirt beneath your feet, the crackling of a fire near your side, the soft whisper of wind through grass that's never known a road. Picture the slowness. The silence. The stillness. History doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, just loud enough to follow into sleep. As dawn broke, a pale, hesitant light crept into the mouth of the cave, softening the edges of the stone and warming the cold shadows of the night. The world outside was still wrapped in morning silence, broken only by the gentle murmur of wind moving through the trees and the first tentative calls of birds welcoming the sun. Inside, the tribe remained bundled in the warmth of furs and each other, bodies curved like commas around the flickering remains of last night's fire. There were no clocks, no sudden alarms, no electric buzzes to shatter the quiet, only the subtle language of nature whispering, "It's time." The fire had grown tired during the night, now nothing more than red-orange embers nestled beneath a curtain of soft gray ash. A few among them stirred, slowly, lazily, blinking against the shifting light, stretching limbs stiff from sleep, brushing hair from their eyes as they sat up and glanced around. No one spoke at first. The morning belonged to silence, to the hush of breath, to the rustle of hide and fur, to the ancient rhythm of rising without rush. One of the older women reached for a stick and gently prodded the coals, stirring life back into the fire with the patience of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Sparks blinked like fireflies, and a faint trail of smoke curled toward the ceiling of the cave. She added a few dry twigs from a pile nearby, coaxing warmth back into the heart of the hearth, her hands moving with unthinking grace. Around her, others began to wake, not all at once, but like waves lapping slowly against a quiet shore. A child yawned and rubbed their eyes, still caught between dream and waking. A man rose, scratched at his beard, and padded softly to the cave's edge to peer out into the forest beyond. The world outside was cool and damp with dew, the leaves glistening in the slanted light, the air still holding the chill of night. Birds darted from branch to branch in the trees, calling softly to each other, and somewhere far off, a stream murmured over stones, its voice as ancient as time. There was no urgency. No pressing schedule. The day would unfold as it chose, and the people would move with it like leaves drifting downstream. One woman knelt to crush dried herbs between her fingers, releasing their earthy scent into the air as she prepared something to chew or steep, a gentle nudge for the stomach to wake up. A few people stepped out into the forest in pairs or alone, gathering the early offerings of the land, berries hanging in clusters like forgotten ornaments, small mushrooms peeking shyly from under mossy logs, smooth stones that might serve as tools, dry twigs for the next fire. The act of gathering was not frantic but careful, observant. They moved slowly, with respect, their eyes trained to notice details, a broken branch that hinted at deer nearby, the telltale holes of burrowing insects, the shimmering thread of spiderwebs dancing in the light. Even the youngest among them had a quiet wisdom, knowing which berries to touch and which to leave, which roots to pull and which to avoid. Back in the cave, the fire had regained its strength, its glow now flickering off the stone walls like a soft heartbeat. Some sat near it, letting the warmth seep into their bones. Others began to sort through items gathered the day before, scraping hides clean, rubbing stone tools smooth, repairing bindings made of sinew and bark. No one gave orders. Tasks flowed naturally from hands that knew what to do. Conversation remained minimal, broken by stretches of shared quiet. A soft comment here. A brief chuckle there. Words, when they came, were practical, rooted in the now. And yet, there was a kind of language in the silence itself, a communal understanding, a shared rhythm that did not need to be spoken aloud. It was in the way one person handed a branch to another without asking. In the way a glance was enough to say, "I'll take that path today." This was not idleness. It was the quiet hum of early humanity, living in tune with the earth's soft metronome. Children played nearby, their laughter light and scattered. They imitated what they saw, dragging small sticks as if they were spears, arranging stones into circles, whispering made-up tales to one another. Sometimes they paused to watch the adults, mimicking their gestures with exaggerated care, pretending to stir imaginary fires or inspect invisible fruits. The line between play and learning was thin. Every motion was a rehearsal for a life that would unfold slowly in the same forest, under the same sky. And as the morning stretched toward noon, the pace remained unhurried. Some sat outside the cave, faces tilted to the sun, soaking in its warmth as they rested tired muscles or quieted anxious minds. The light filtered through leaves in dappled patterns, dancing on the ground like ancient code. Insects hummed lazily nearby. A squirrel darted up a tree. A bird pecked curiously at the ground, then flitted away. Life was everywhere, not loud, but steady. Not rushed, but persistent. There was no distinction between productive and unproductive time. A person could sit still for an hour, and that hour would not be wasted. It might be spent listening to the forest, to the creak of branches swaying overhead, the call of birds echoing between trees, the sudden rustle of something unseen in the underbrush. Others might spend that same hour walking, following paths worn smooth by countless feet before theirs. Some paths led to familiar places, a freshwater spring, a flat rock where drying skins were laid out, a clearing filled with wildflowers. Others led to places less often visited, deeper woods, strange rock formations, forgotten hollows that whispered of stories now lost. These small explorations were not called hikes or adventures. They were just part of life, as essential and natural as breathing. The early human did not separate themselves from nature. They were nature, a part of the landscape, shaped by it, shaping it in turn, and as the morning faded, perhaps a rabbit was spotted. A signal passed silently through gestures and eye movements. A few gathered spears. Not in haste, but with quiet preparation. They moved as one, coordinated, purposeful. The chase was brief. Whether it ended in success or not, it was followed by stillness. A moment of reverence for the animal, or for the effort spent. If successful, the group returned with calm satisfaction. The meat would be shared later. If not, no anger followed. Only adjustment. Another plan. Another path. Another day. Food was a gift, not an entitlement. And whether the hunger eased or lingered, the sun still shone, the fire still burned, and the earth still offered itself in countless small ways. Back at the cave, others might have begun preparing a simple mash of roots, or drying leftover meat on flat stones. Water was carried in wooden bowls or animal bladders. Some chewed bark to clean their teeth, others sat close and helped pick lice from one another's hair. This was their morning. A few hours of light and life, of motion and stillness, of quiet cooperation and patient attention. It lacked spectacle. There were no grand monuments being built, no dramatic discoveries, no stirring speeches. Just people, alive, aware, attuned to the gentle turning of the world around them. The forest did not need to be conquered. The fire did not need to be perfected. The berry did not need to be improved. Everything was enough. And because it was enough, so were they. The hum of life in the early human morning was not loud or impressive by modern standards. But it was steady. It was sacred. And in its slowness, it offered something we often forget how to seek: peace, presence, and the beauty of simply waking up and being. Fire was their heartbeat, not just a source of warmth, but the flickering soul of their lives. It stood at the center of everything, glowing gently at the heart of the cave or camp, casting long shadows on the stone and soft light on faces weathered by wind and time. Fire was not a tool, not merely a utility. It was a companion. A protector. A teacher. It whispered in crackles and hissed in quiet thought, promising safety in the long night, warding off the unseen creatures whose eyes glowed at the edge of the dark. It offered light when the sun had gone, but it also offered a sense of control, fragile, yes, but powerful all the same. Around it, early humans gathered not only to cook but to exist. The warmth that radiated from its core reached not just their skin, but their spirit. It held off the bite of cold wind, the creeping dampness, the chill that settled into bones in the small hours of the night. With fire, they found a center. And around that center, the first quiet circles of community formed. More than anything, fire meant food. Not abundance, but possibility. They didn't always hunt. The hunt was rare, difficult, dangerous. More often, they scavenged, guided by instinct, experience, and luck. They foraged for nuts that clung to branches or fell with the breeze. They dug with sticks and fingers for roots buried in dry soil. They recognized bitter herbs from healing ones. Sometimes, they stumbled across leftovers, the chewed remains of a carcass abandoned by a lion or wolf, still fresh enough to use, if not to enjoy. The fire transformed these humble findings into nourishment. It made the inedible edible, the risky safe. It softened tough meat, dried damp leaves, drew out flavors from bark and bulbs and bones. To cook was to live a little longer. To gather around the flame and chew slowly was to survive. But more than that, it was to share. One person's find became everyone's meal. There was no concept of personal cuisine or individual plates. Food was communal, as much ritual as resource. Cooking was slow, patient, and sacred. It began not with recipes but with the choosing of stones to ring the fire, the arranging of sticks for steady heat, the watching of smoke, the scent of sap and fat as it hissed and popped. Every part of the process was a kind of meditation. The person who turned the meat did so without haste. They listened to the fire's breath, judged its mood. They poked coals and shifted embers, learning from every crack and spark. When meat was roasted, when it was available, it wasn't just eaten. It was experienced. A bite of roasted leg, smoked by flame and seasoned by nothing but time, was something rare and deeply earned. That piece of food represented a full day's labor, a missed spear, a lucky stumble, a sharp eye that saw movement in the grass. Every bite told a story. Every swallow carried the memory of the wind that blew during the chase, the sweat of the search, the danger that followed. There were no wasted meals, and few were taken for granted. Even bitter roots, carefully boiled to reduce their toxins, were respected. Sometimes the food was simple. A handful of nuts passed around the circle. Mushrooms roasted lightly on hot stones. Strips of dried meat chewed for hours while sitting by the fire in silence. Other times, it was slightly more complex, a hollowed stone filled with water, heated with fire-burnished rocks until the water bubbled, turning handfuls of crushed grain or tough greens into a kind of thick, fragrant paste. No matter the meal, the act of eating was rarely solitary. Even when quiet, they ate together. Sitting side by side in the golden light of the fire, sharing what little they had, they found something resembling peace. The fire drew them inward, toward each other. Conversations, if they happened, were slow and sparse. A soft murmur about a trail scene. A memory of a past season. A warning about wolves. But mostly, there was quiet. Chewing. Thinking. Staring into the flames as sparks danced upward into the dark like forgotten thoughts. It was during these meals that the group felt most whole, even if no words passed between them, and there were other gifts that fire offered. It dried hides more evenly, softened sinew for binding, hardened the tips of wooden spears to make them more effective. It helped crack bones to reach the nourishing marrow within. Sometimes, they used fire to shape the very landscape, clearing paths or pushing game animals toward more favorable ground. But these uses, practical as they were, never overshadowed the emotional truth. Fire was presence. Fire was home. In a world where nothing stood still, where the seasons changed with fury and predators lurked behind every tree, fire remained. It was patient, loyal, requiring only fuel and breath. When it died, it could be coaxed back. When it wandered, it could be caught again from lightning or carried as a glowing coal tucked into bark and moss. Keeping fire alive meant keeping the group alive. And so, someone always watched it. Even at night, as others slept, one person remained awake to feed it, whispering thoughts to it perhaps, or humming softly. Not because they were instructed to, but because the fire was sacred, and sacred things deserved care. The relationship between fire and food was deeply intertwined with identity. Around the flame, they were not just animals surviving. They were something more. They were creatures who tamed light. Who cooked their meals instead of devouring them raw. Who warmed the old, protected the young, gathered in ritual and remembered things. Around fire, memory took shape. They began to recall which roots had worked and which hadn't. Which fish appeared in which season. Which branch snapped in just the right way. These memories weren't written, but they were kept, passed down in quiet instruction or mimicked by curious children. Food became more than nourishment, it was culture, in its earliest form. The way a fish was roasted, or a bone split, or a tuber peeled, these were traditions, as old and as rich as any language. And as they sat by the fire night after night, generation after generation, that culture deepened. Fire didn't just feed their stomachs. It fed their minds. As they waited for food to cook, they had time to reflect. Time to tell stories, or imagine things that weren't. They might speak of spirits who lived in trees, or of ancestors whose souls rode in the clouds. They might pass along warnings about the river, or make up tales about the stars. This slow space between hunger and satisfaction gave room for thought. And thought led to wonder. Perhaps it was while waiting for a hare to roast that someone first noticed how shadows moved on the cave wall. Perhaps it was during a late-night fire watching that someone saw an ember glow like an eye. And wondered if the fire itself could see. In these quiet spaces, something uniquely human was forming, not just a body that needed food, but a mind that needed meaning, and yet, for all this, the act of eating remained humble. There were no feasts. No utensils. No fanfare. Just small, slow rituals of survival. A piece of bark used to scoop mash. Fingers burned slightly on hot meat. Ash clinging to the side of a root. And after the meal, the remains were often offered back to the land. Bones left near the fire's edge. Bits of bark tossed into the flame. Not wasteful, never that, but intentional. An unspoken understanding that what fed them today had been alive yesterday. And what was left behind might feed something else tomorrow. The fire, too, consumed wood, grass, dried dung. It took in all things and left behind only warmth and smoke and the glowing reminder that all things change form. When sleep finally came, it came easily. Full bellies, warm skin, tired limbs. The fire settled too, curling into a gentler shape. Those who lay nearby watched the final flames blink slowly, their light dimming, as if it too were falling asleep. And they dreamed, not of grand things, but of simple ones. Of food gathered, meals shared, fire lit. The next day would begin again with the same tasks, the same motions, but none of it was wasted. Because in those moments, roasting, sharing, sitting in the soft light, they were fully alive. And in their own quiet way, they were writing the first, unwritten chapters of human history. They walked often, not out of boredom or leisure, but because walking was the closest thing early humans had to a language with the earth. Each step was both discovery and remembrance, a quiet negotiation between the land and those who moved across it. They didn't walk for fitness or wander in circles for entertainment. They walked to know, to map the slow curve of rivers, to learn the sleeping places of animals, to feel the changes in wind and season not from a distance, but with their skin. These journeys were long, often beginning before the sun had fully risen and ending only when it dropped low again. Their feet carried them over grasslands and across riverbeds, through forests dappled with shifting light and over rocks warm from the afternoon sun. Some carried tools, others carried nothing. Some walked alone, eyes sharp for signs of deer or wild boar. Others moved in quiet groups, speaking only when necessary, their voices soft so as not to disturb the rhythm of their progress. There was a kind of meditation in the movement, the steady repetition of footsteps matched to the sway of branches overhead or the calls of birds echoing between trees. These were not hurried journeys. Even when hunger was sharp or the air hinted at approaching rain, they did not rush. They observed. They waited. They learned. The land was their textbook, and every walk was a page turned. They read the patterns in the mud, the imprint of a cloven hoof, the twist of a snake's path, the dragging mark where something heavy had moved. They traced the trails worn smooth by herds and knew which ones were recent, which were old. Sometimes they paused, crouched low to the ground, fingers brushing against crushed leaves or broken twigs. Was this the trail of a boar? A lynx? A bear? They knew not just by sight, but by scent, by silence, by the way the forest behaved when a predator had passed. They watched birds take flight, listened for sudden stillness in the underbrush. Every motion held meaning. And they stored this meaning not in books or tablets but in memory, a shared memory, carried like a living map within the minds of those who had walked the land year after year. Children learned by walking with elders. They listened to stories told in hushed tones, stories of a trail that vanished in winter, of a crossing where the river ran low after a dry season, of a high ridge where one could see for miles and spot danger before it arrived. Some days, the walking had a clear purpose. The group needed water, or a better source of food. They followed a known trail to a grove of trees where nuts would be ripe, or to a cliff where birds nested and eggs could be gathered. But just as often, the purpose was softer, less urgent. They walked to follow the herds, not to catch them today, but to know where they would be tomorrow. They walked to find new shelters, caves hidden in the folds of stone, hollows in the earth where they could rest if needed. They walked because walking was the act of paying attention, of being present in the body and on the land. As they moved, they marked the sun's path across the sky, the changing scent of the air, the way clouds gathered and dissolved. They moved through the day not as strangers to the landscape but as part of it. And the landscape, in turn, revealed its secrets slowly, a spring hidden beneath moss, a tree that bore fruit out of season, a patch of earth always warmer than the rest. They didn't need to name things to understand them. A bend in the river might be known by the feel of its current, the color of the rocks beneath its surface, the hum of insects nearby. A path through the hills was remembered not by a word, but by a feeling, the way the wind curved around the stones, the sound of distant echoes, the sharp scent of pine. They walked until their legs ached, then kept walking. They didn't see it as endurance. It was just how life was measured, in distances, in routes taken, in the changing scenery that unfolded with each slow step. And when they did stop, it was deliberate. A rest beneath a tree. A pause beside a stream. A stretch of shade where they might share a strip of dried meat or a few sweet berries. They drank deeply, not just from the water but from the quiet, letting their minds settle as their bodies slowed. Sometimes they would fall asleep beneath the trees, not from exhaustion but from trust. The land held them. The earth was firm beneath them, the sky vast above. There was a rhythm to it all, footstep, breath, glance, step. Over and over. Their pace adjusted with the terrain. Over flat ground they walked upright and relaxed, shoulders back, eyes sweeping far ahead. On hills, they leaned forward, balancing with sticks or arms. In the forest, they ducked low, weaving through branches, alert to the snap of twigs or the flutter of birds. When they walked through high grass, their hands skimmed the tops of blades, feeling for insects or hidden movement. In sand, they moved more slowly, muscles working harder, steps sinking slightly with each shift. And always, there was sound, not noise, but natural rhythm. The whisper of grass, the hum of insects, the occasional startled cry of a bird overhead. Even the sound of their own breathing, their own heartbeat, became part of the music of the walk. And in that music, they found comfort. The walk wasn't always easy. There were sharp rocks, sudden storms, aching feet. But these were not seen as burdens. They were just part of it. When they traveled in groups, there was a quiet choreography. One person might lead, another trail behind to make sure no one was lost. Others moved to the sides, watching for danger, marking the landscape. They passed gestures down the line, a lifted hand, a pointed finger, to signal a change in direction or something spotted ahead. Sometimes, they sang softly as they walked, not songs as we think of them, but low chants, wordless melodies that rose and fell with their steps. These sounds helped set a pace, kept the group together, and perhaps even soothed the mind. Alone, a walker might speak to the trees or hum to the wind. They didn't need to be heard. They just needed to be connected. And walking connected them. To the path. To each other. To the invisible threads that tied one place to the next. And always, the land gave back, a glimpse of antlers through leaves, a forgotten patch of berries, the sudden, silent movement of a hare darting through ferns. At night, after long walks, the soles of their feet were sore, the muscles in their legs tired. But it was a good tired, the kind that sank deep and left the body loose and warm. Around the fire, they sat with their legs outstretched, flexing toes, massaging calves. They talked about what they had seen. A bend in the river that hadn't been there before. A herd of animals moving differently. A path that felt somehow unfamiliar. They shared these details like treasure, small, quiet discoveries that would help shape tomorrow. They didn't draw maps. They drew paths in memory, in story, in feeling. The land was not a surface to be crossed. It was a story to be read again and again, each time a little differently. And walking was the way they read it. Not with eyes alone, but with the full body. With ears alert, with fingers grazing bark, with the soles of their feet carrying stories written in stone, soil, and time. Walking didn't separate them from the world, it united them with it. And when they walked long enough, often enough, they no longer questioned where they were. They belonged. The land was not a backdrop. It was home. So they walked, not always to go somewhere new, but sometimes just to remember. To remember the curve of the earth beneath them. To remember what it felt like to exist not in the rush of time, but in the rhythm of steps, in the stillness between destinations. And in doing so, they carried the past forward, step by step, into every tomorrow that followed. Afternoons often brought rest, not just because the body needed it, but because the world itself seemed to slow down. The sun, high overhead, painted long golden beams through the leaves, warming the backs of those who found shade beneath trees or the overhang of a rocky hill. The urgency of morning had passed. The gathering was done, the fire fed, and the midday heat discouraged long journeys. So they stopped. They sat. They lay down on the earth. Some closed their eyes for a while, drifting into half-sleep, while others simply stared upward, watching the soft ballet of clouds moving across the sky. There was no noise to drown them out, no hum of machines, no beeping, no talking heads. The only soundtrack was the breeze moving slowly through tall grass, the distant cry of birds, the occasional chirp of insects nearby. In this stillness, they began to notice things, not all at once, and not always consciously, but over time, they started to see the rhythm of the world stitched across the heavens above them. They watched how certain birds flew higher before rain. How clouds changed shape just before dusk. How the sun moved ever so slightly from one day to the next. These weren't facts yet. They weren't lessons. They were feelings. Impressions. Truths passed gently between generations without ever needing to be written. Lying on their backs, eyes half shut against the light, they noticed how the sky was not just blue but full of signs. When the wind shifted and the leaves on the trees turned their undersides upward, someone older would murmur about rain. When the birds grew quiet in the hottest part of the day, it meant a predator might be near, or the heat too sharp to waste breath on song. These signals became part of their language, not the spoken kind, but the deeper, older one made of watching and waiting. Children learned it without realizing. A father might point with his chin to the shape of a hawk circling. A mother might squint at the horizon and mutter something low. These tiny gestures held years of knowledge, wisdom shaped by patterns seen not once or twice but over and over, summer after summer, season after season. The sky was their teacher. A vast blackboard with no chalk, only shifting color, light, and movement. They learned to read it not in hours or days, but in lifetimes. They knew when to seek shelter before a storm. They sensed when the air was too still, when the pressure too heavy, when the silence felt strange. They didn't name the constellations yet, but they saw them. At night, as the fire crackled and sleep edged close, their eyes tilted skyward. The stars blinked above them, cold, distant, ancient. And in those stars, they saw order. Shapes. Routes. Memories. One group of stars always appeared as the nights grew colder. Another seemed to sink earlier and earlier until it vanished entirely for weeks. Some stars moved. Others stayed fixed. This became a quiet science, a map written in light. They didn't give the stars names, but they gave them meaning. This cluster meant the time of berries was close. That glowing belt in the sky? It told them the herds would begin to move again. The moon, too, became a clock of sorts. They noticed how its face changed, how it seemed to rise in different places, how it pulled the tides in subtle ways even they could sense by the dampness of soil or the way fish moved in streams. No one explained this. There were no lessons written on bark or stone. It was shared by eyes, one person looking, another following their gaze, a nod of understanding passed from one heart to the next. Sometimes they would sit for hours, doing nothing at all, just observing. A vulture soaring in wide spirals. A sudden shift in cloud color. The strange stillness that came before distant thunder. They did not rush to conclusions. They didn't try to control it. They simply watched. And from that watching, a kind of trust was born. They knew that time moved in circles. That the wind would return, the sun would set, the cold would lift, the sky would clear. And this knowledge brought comfort. In a world where so little could be relied upon, where food might be scarce and predators lurked, the sky was faithful. It changed, yes, but in ways that could be known. Afternoon became a time not of action, but of alignment. Of syncing their internal rhythm with the larger breath of the earth and sky. They didn't fight the stillness. They folded into it. And the more they watched, the more they understood that everything was connected, the color of the sky, the movement of animals, the sounds of birds, the shape of clouds, the direction of wind. It all spoke in the same voice. Occasionally, someone would point and murmur something vague, a prediction perhaps, or a memory. Last time the clouds moved like that, the rain was hard. Or, that star is early this year. These weren't prophecies. They were pieces of knowledge still forming, passed gently like fire from one person to the next. Children listened even when they didn't understand. Later, as they grew, they would hear those words again in their minds, and slowly, over time, the pattern would become visible to them too. There was no rush to knowing. The earth taught slowly, and so they learned slowly. And this slowness was sacred. There was no test to pass, no race to the answer. Just steady observation, quiet trust, and a growing bond between the human spirit and the sky it lived beneath. The afternoons made this possible, the soft hours between effort and sleep, where nothing needed to be done and everything could simply be seen. When storms rolled in, they felt it first in their bones. The air thickened. The light darkened. The birds flew lower, then vanished. They would pack up slowly, deliberately, covering the fire with stones or moving their belongings to higher ground. There was no panic, just preparation. They had seen this before. They would see it again. And when the rain came, they watched that too. The way it hit the earth, the way it moved in waves across the grass, the way lightning lit up the inside of clouds like fire trapped in cotton. To them, even storms were lessons. A reminder of power. Of rhythm. Of renewal. And when the rain passed and the sun returned, they would stretch in the steam and warmth, shake off their furs, and resume watching. Always watching. The clouds drifting apart. The sun lowering once more. The sky bleeding soft colors, rose, lavender, gold, as day gave way to night. And in this quiet transition, they felt the wisdom of the world settling around them like a soft blanket. They may not have had books or writing, but their minds were libraries. Full of remembered skies, of seen before sunsets, of winds that carried stories across grasslands. In the slow hours of the afternoon, they didn't waste time, they recorded it in memory. A particular bird's call. A pattern of ants disturbed by coming rain. The way dust hung longer in the air just before a cold front. These were details we now call science, data, meteorology. But to them, they were simply life. Life read through eyes and ears and skin. Life understood without formulas. It was knowledge alive in motion, carried across generations not in ink, but in breath and observation. And because it was never written, it had to be passed with care. Not just spoken, but shown. Demonstrated. Felt. It was a slow inheritance, and that slowness made it durable. Trustworthy. True. So in the quiet heat of the afternoon, when modern minds would reach for a screen or task or distraction, they simply looked up. And they looked out. They saw the drift of time across the sky. They felt the pulse of weather through the movement of leaves. They read the language of light. And in doing so, they knew not just where they were, but when they were. They lived in a world without clocks, but they were never lost in time. The sun, the wind, the stars, and the birds gave them all they needed to understand their place. To know when to move. When to stay. When to prepare. When to rest. And in that stillness, that beautiful, unhurried stillness, they became the first quiet scientists of the earth and sky. Not every day was adventurous. Not every sunrise brought a journey, a hunt, or a thrilling discovery. Some days began and ended quietly, with little more than the soft scrape of stone on stone, or the muffled knock of bone against wood. These were the days when they stayed close to the cave, when the paths that led out into the world beyond remained undisturbed, and their footsteps never strayed far from the familiar circle of firelight. These were the slow days, the silent ones, when the world seemed to exhale and pause, and when survival did not demand movement, but stillness. On such days, there were no predators to outwit, no herds to follow, no storms to flee. Instead, the people turned inward, toward the tasks that were always waiting, the quiet, repetitive labor that formed the foundation of their lives. A man would sit with a river-smoothed stone in one hand and a jagged piece of flint in the other, striking carefully, watching sparks leap and slivers fall. He wasn't inventing anything new. He was repeating something he'd done countless times, shaping the same tool his ancestors had shaped, letting instinct and memory guide the angle of each strike. Beside him, a woman bent over a piece of bone, scraping it slowly with a sharp edge, thinning it, curving it, hollowing it, perhaps into a needle, or a hook, or some small, useful point. There was no rush. No deadline. No bell to ring when the task was complete. It didn't matter if it took an hour or a day or 2 full afternoons to finish one tool. The only clock they followed was the movement of the sun above and the feeling of hunger in their stomachs. Time was not something to fight, it was something to live within. And so, their work matched the pace of the day. Slow. Focused. Unbothered. Children might sit nearby, half playing, half learning, copying the motions they saw, sometimes making something by accident, a chip that cut too deep, a crack that broke the bone the wrong way. But no one scolded. Mistakes were part of the rhythm. The wrong shape taught them the right one. The broken shard was saved, maybe used for something smaller. Everything had a place, a purpose, even the flawed. In this way, skill was passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, not through lectures or blueprints, but through patient repetition, silent observation, and shared space. Others might spend the day weaving reeds into loose baskets or binding animal sinew into thread. A cracked hide needed mending, or a worn sling needed repair. Everything they owned had been made by hand, not bought, not borrowed, and so every item carried the weight of hours and effort. A single tool might take days to shape, and when it broke, it was not discarded lightly. Sometimes someone would spend an entire afternoon sharpening tools dulled from use, not because it was exciting, but because it needed doing. The act of dragging stone across stone, again and again, formed a kind of rhythm. Scrape, lift, scrape, lift. It wasn't art, and it wasn't glory. It was maintenance. Survival in its simplest form. Yet in that repetition, there was peace. a strange sort of calm. Hands busy, minds quiet, time passing like a soft current, not a rushing tide. They didn't speak much while they worked. They didn't need to. The tasks were familiar, and the company was steady. The sound of tools being made, taps, scrapes, the creak of stretched hide, filled the air like background music, steady and grounding. Around them, the world went on in its usual way. Birds hopped between branches overhead, pecking at bark. A squirrel might dart through the underbrush. Insects buzzed lazily. The wind moved through the trees like breath. And still they worked, not frantically, not distractedly, but with quiet attention. A boy might pause to pick a beetle from a log, watch it crawl across his fingers, then set it down again. A girl might try threading bone through hide, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, laughing quietly when it slipped. These were small, private moments, unnoticed by history, but they were life. Real, tangible, lived life, made not of great conquests or sudden genius, but of many patient hours spent in ordinary tasks. And those ordinary tasks built everything. The tools to hunt. The baskets to carry food. The bindings to hold their shelters together. Nothing was flashy. Everything was essential. And in that quiet necessity, they found meaning. Not dramatic meaning. Not the kind written in stone. But the slow kind. The kind that builds over years. The kind that lasts. They didn't think of these tasks as chores. They were simply part of the day, like breathing, like waking, like watching the fire glow brighter as the sun dipped low. There was no list to check off. Just what needed doing, when it felt right to do it. One person might decide to carve something small, a figure, a charm, a shape that reminded them of an animal or a storm. Maybe it had purpose. Maybe not. But the act of carving, of pressing stone into bone, of shaping meaning into form, was its own reward. Another might pick up a half-finished spear, test its balance, adjust its weight. They would run their fingers along the grain of the wood, feel the slight imperfections, and smooth them slowly with stone. These hands were not hurried. They had seen seasons come and go. They had watched animals grow and die. They knew that the best things took time. That sharpness came not from force, but from patience. That even the hardest stone gave way when touched enough. Sometimes, someone would hum softly, a tuneless song, more rhythm than melody. It helped the work pass. Not faster, but easier. The hum blended with the scraping and tapping and sighing, creating a kind of shared atmosphere. Others might join in, or not. No one minded either way. This was not performance. It was expression. Gentle. Simple. Real. And outside, the day moved on. The light shifted. Shadows lengthened. The air grew cooler. Birds quieted. And still, they worked. Not endlessly, not obsessively. Just steadily. When hunger returned, they paused. Shared a few dried berries. Passed around a piece of old meat or a hunk of root. Then they resumed, or they didn't. Some lay back and rested. Others stared into the canopy above, watching the branches sway. The work could wait. It always did. In this rhythm, there was no stress. No pressure to finish before dark. No guilt in resting. No fear of not doing enough. The only rule was balance, enough tools to get by, enough repairs to stay safe, enough energy left for tomorrow. And so they lived gently within their limits. They didn't overwork the land, or themselves. They made what they needed, fixed what was broken, improved what could be better. That was all. And it was enough. These slow, uneventful days, the days historians rarely talk about, the days with no war or migration or invention, were the true spine of human history. They held up everything else. And the people who lived them didn't need fanfare to feel fulfilled. They had their hands, their tools, their time, their place. They had each other. And when the sky began to soften into twilight and the tools were set down, they looked up and stretched. Backs cracked. Shoulders rolled. Fingers flexed. The work was done for now, not completed, but paused. Tomorrow would bring more. More sharpening. More scraping. More shaping. But they didn't dread it. They didn't dream of escaping it. It was life. Honest, quiet, necessary life. They returned to the fire as the stars began to blink into being. Someone tossed a branch onto the coals. The flames flared gently. A sigh passed around the circle, not from tiredness, but from release. The day was done. The tools were ready. And in the simple stillness between work and sleep, they found peace. No achievements to list. No milestones reached. Just another day lived fully, patiently, quietly, one chip of stone at a time. Children played then, just as they do now. The world might have been rougher, the dangers more immediate, but the instinct to run, to giggle, to imagine and explore, that was the same. In the quiet corners of the camp, just beyond the adults sharpening tools or weaving hides, small groups of children created entire worlds out of dust, leaves, sticks, and feathers. They had no carved dolls, no painted balls, no glowing screens, but they had what they needed: imagination, space, and time. A curved stick became a spear. A piece of bark became a bowl. A feather tucked behind the ear made one a great hunter or a sneaky bird. They crouched low behind bushes, watching each other with wide, unblinking eyes, pretending to stalk prey through the tall grass. Then a burst of laughter would break the silence as one hunter leapt up and surprised the others, and the game would tumble into a chase, not away from real danger, but into the pure delight of movement. Bare feet pattered against warm earth. Hands clutched imaginary weapons. Voices rose in delight, in challenge, in play. These games weren't organized, not scheduled or structured, but they had rules, rules that lived in memory, passed down from older children to younger ones, refined over countless afternoons of trial and error. Sometimes they mimicked the adults with surprising accuracy. Little hands tied fibers into pretend slings, mimicked the way a grown-up would hunch low to examine tracks, or pretended to gather herbs into imaginary pouches. They watched everything: how elders moved, spoke, shared, worked, and repeated it in miniature, clumsy at first, then better, sharper, more confident. In this way, play became practice. Without knowing it, they were learning the skills they'd someday need: how to track, how to hide, how to notice things others missed. A game of hide-and-seek wasn't just fun. It taught stillness, patience, awareness. Racing one another through uneven ground wasn't just about winning. It trained balance, strength, instinct. The imaginary beasts they escaped from were made of fantasy, but the lessons learned were very real. Fear, courage, speed, cooperation, all wrapped in laughter and dust. And even the accidents, a fall, a scraped knee, a lost feather, became part of the learning. Older children comforted younger ones, helped them up, brushed off the dirt. In doing so, they learned empathy, responsibility, connection. The adults watched sometimes, but they rarely intervened unless danger was real. A glance would be enough, a nod from one elder to another, acknowledging that the children were safe, occupied, learning. The camp was small, the land familiar, and the boundaries of safety were known. So children were given freedom, and with that freedom came confidence. They climbed trees with small, fearless hands, they splashed in shallow streams, they invented stories about the rustling in the grass or the shape of clouds above. One might shout, "That's a mammoth's shadow," pointing at a hill. Another might respond, "No, it's a sleeping spirit," and together they would build a tale that lasted the whole afternoon. Stories unfolded between games. sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, often sung, in broken rhythms or nonsense words. These early games were alive, not only with fun, but with knowledge. When the heat of the day grew heavy, they'd pause in the shade. Someone might gather a circle of pebbles and arrange them carefully. Another would collect feathers or interesting seeds. A favorite stick might become a prize, passed from one winner to the next. Sometimes they traded treasures, not for value, but for meaning. A smooth rock for a crooked twig. A pine cone for a shiny shell. They made meaning where there was none, just as all children do. The objects weren't special on their own, but within the game, they became powerful. A token of victory. A sign of friendship. A key to a secret place only the children knew. And the world of the adults, with its sharp tools and silent watches, remained distant for a while, hovering like the edge of a dream, not yet fully real. These were the years when joy came easiest, when time passed without being counted, when the sun moved unnoticed across the sky until a parent called out and the games ended for the day. Laughter echoed through the trees, across the rocks, over the soft dust of the earth. It was a bright sound, one that carried far, and it reminded everyone, even the elders, that life was not only survival. It was connection. It was growth. It was joy. In those giggles, in those games, the future took shape. The ones who fell today would rise tomorrow. The ones who pretended to lead would someday lead for real. And the adults who sat nearby, weaving or carving, would occasionally smile to themselves, recognizing an old move, a game they'd played long ago, a moment once theirs, now passed down. It was continuity. It was culture, formed not just through fires and hunts and tools, but through play, honest, loud, messy play. No one had to teach them how. They were born knowing. Because humans, even in their most ancient form, were creatures of creativity. Of motion. Of shared wonder. Sometimes the games turned quiet. A few children would sit together, arranging patterns in sand with sticks, drawing lines, circles, symbols they didn't understand but felt important. They traced spirals, dots, animal shapes. Maybe it meant something. Maybe not. But the act itself, making marks, leaving something behind, was instinctual. The same instinct that would, centuries later, lead someone to paint on cave walls or carve symbols into stone. The earliest forms of art might have been born not from ceremony, but from children at play. From idle doodles scratched into earth. From games of pretend that slowly grew into memory and myth. The line between fun and meaning was thin. And in those moments, as they shaped things with their hands, early humanity looked forward, not with intention, but with wonder. And though the world could be harsh, filled with real beasts and cold nights and hunger, play was a shield. It gave them strength they didn't know they had. It reminded them of joy in the midst of need. Even when food was low, or someone was sick, or the weather turned, children found time to play. They played in the rain. They played with shadows. They played with their own breath on cold mornings. And each game, however small, was a form of resistance. A way to say, we are still here. We are still learning. We are still human. And when the light began to fade, when the fire was lit again and the grown-ups called them close, they gathered, sweaty, scratched, smiling. Their treasures clutched in small fists. Their stories tumbling out in rushed voices. Their tired legs curling beneath them as sleep crept in. And sometimes, even then, the games continued, quieter, gentler. A feather waved above a sleeping sibling. A whispered dare. A dream reenacted in a half-dozing murmur. Until, finally, their breath slowed, their eyes closed, and the day ended in stillness once more. Some days, they painted. Not for celebration or beauty, not for gallery or glory, but simply because something inside them needed to be seen, not now, not even by those around them, but by someone, someday. These weren't paintings framed and hung, weren't placed in bright sunlight for all to admire. Instead, they were hidden deep within the earth, on stone walls far from the wind and the weather, far from the reach of passing animals or the fading eye of time. They would walk into the caves, one by one, torchlight flickering off damp walls, the air cool and close, thick with the scent of minerals and quiet. They brought with them color not squeezed from a tube but gathered by hand, red from iron-rich earth, yellow from ochre, black from ash and char, white from crushed bone or chalk. Berries were mashed, charcoal ground, fat or water added to make the mixture hold. There were no palettes, no easels. The colors lived in hollowed stones, in simple containers made from cracked shells or curled bark. And the brushes, if they had them at all, were fashioned from twigs, frayed grasses, fingers, and breath. They didn't always know what they would paint. Sometimes it was a shape remembered from a hunt, a bison seen just before dusk, a horse galloping through tall grass, a deer lifting its head to the wind. Sometimes it was simply a hand, pressed flat against the wall, fingers outstretched, pigment blown across it like a shadow captured mid-thought. These handprints still remain, thousands of years later, and we cannot know whose they were. But in them is something strangely intimate. A person was there. A real person, breathing slowly in the dark, reaching out not to touch the stone, but to become part of it. And with that single gesture, simple, ancient, wordless, they spoke to us. They said, "I was here. I saw this. I felt this." No caption. No signature. Just presence. Just paint and patience and the need to leave something behind. The walls became journals, dreamscapes, memories carved in color. And unlike their tools or fires or shelters, these paintings were not for immediate use. You couldn't eat a painting. You couldn't sharpen it or wear it or use it to carry water. And yet, they made them anyway. Which means the need must have been deep as hunger, maybe deeper. A hunger to remember. A hunger to be remembered. Maybe they believed the act of painting captured something vital, the spirit of the animal, the rhythm of the hunt, the curve of a dream glimpsed in firelight. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe they just liked how it felt, the motion of hand on wall, the focus it demanded, the hush it created among those watching. Children might have stood nearby, wide-eyed, whispering. Elders might have hummed softly, the sound echoing off the stone. The painter crouched or stood or sat, lit by torchlight and silence, creating something that would outlive them all. There was no audience. No applause. The cave was the witness, and time the only companion. These weren't artists in the modern sense. They didn't paint for fame or fortune. They painted to hold on. To anchor something fleeting. A moment. A story. A thought too large to keep inside. And once the image was complete, once the horse had taken shape, or the hunting scene stretched across the rock, they stepped back, breathed deeply, and left it there. They didn't tear it down or paint over it. They let it live. Some images remained alone, others joined over time by more animals, more shapes, more hands. Layer upon layer, as if generations returned to the same spot, touched the same wall, and added their own whispers. The caves became libraries of the unseen. Of memory, movement, wonder. Not everyone painted. But everyone felt the weight of it. The sacredness. The quiet. To be allowed inside was a kind of honor. To watch, a lesson. The younger ones would remember the colors, the shapes, the way the torchlight made the painted creatures shimmer as if they were moving. And those memories would become part of their inner world. Long before written language, before alphabets and ink, there were these stories told in color and form, stories without words, yet full of voice. Some caves were returned to again and again, while others held just one image, forever alone in the dark, a secret kept by the mountain itself. We can only guess what they meant. Were they rituals? Were they dreams? Did the people believe the painted animals gave them strength, or courage, or connection to something unseen, or were the paintings just a mirror, a way to reflect what they already felt inside? Because it is a strange and wonderful thing, this act of creating something from nothing. Of imagining what could be, and making it real with dirt and breath. Even in a harsh world, with danger at the door and hunger often close behind, they made time for art. They made time for wonder. They stepped out of the circle of daily needs and into something slower, deeper, quieter. It wasn't always beautiful. It wasn't always understood. But it was always honest. And honesty has a way of lasting. These images have outlived kingdoms. Outlived languages. Outlived even memory. And still, they speak, not in words, but in the soft, steady truth of their being. And when the painting was done, and the fire flickered low, and the last echo faded into stone, they turned and walked back into the world. Back to the fire, back to the others, back to the steady rhythm of life. But something lingered. A trace of pigment on a fingertip. A shape still glowing in the mind. A feeling that something had been given, not taken. Something shared. And in the quiet that followed, perhaps they dreamed differently. Perhaps the stars looked brighter. Or the wind carried a sound that reminded them of what they had painted. These weren't just decorations. They were bridges, between thought and matter, between one life and the next. And now, thousands of years later, someone else walks into that same cave, torch in hand, breath held, eyes wide, and sees what they left behind. The horses, the hands, the ancient red lines that once glowed like fire. And the silence is the same. And the feeling, that small, tender awe, it's the same too. That's the miracle. That's the power of a whisper that never fades. A dream that survives in stone. A message painted not to be understood, but to be felt. In the evenings, the elders spoke. Not in loud declarations or commands, not in the stern voices of authority, but in low, steady murmurs, slow, drifting stories that curled through the air like smoke from the fire. The day was done. The food had been shared. The tools were put away. The children had run and laughed and now sat still, their energy settled like dust after a breeze. The fire cracked quietly, casting shifting light against the cave walls or onto the rough circle of faces drawn close by the warmth. Shadows danced behind them, long and flickering, while above, the stars turned unseen. There were no books to reach for, no instruments or distractions. Just fire, breath, and memory. This was the oldest classroom, the first theater, the original heartbeat of history, a circle of humans, gathered not for survival now, but for connection. And the elders, those who had seen many seasons, whose hair had thinned and hands had slowed, began to speak. Sometimes it started with a single word. Sometimes just a sound. But always, the others leaned in. Not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Because something in those quiet stories mattered. The tales were not lessons, not obviously. No one said, "This is what you must remember," or "This is what you should do." Instead, they let the story carry its own weight. A tale of a great hunt long ago, when the skies turned red and the deer ran together in a stampede so loud it shook the ground. A tale of a winter so long and deep that even the rivers stopped speaking, and how the people survived by listening to a bird's call and following it to shelter. A tale of dreams, strange ones, wild ones, where animals spoke, or stars fell, or old friends returned with messages no one understood. The stories didn't need to make perfect sense. That wasn't the point. They carried rhythm. They carried tone. They carried truth in ways that went beneath the surface, slipping into the mind like water into soil. No one interrupted. Even the youngest children, wriggling slightly in their furs or twirling a feather in their fingers, listened. Because they knew, without being told, that these moments mattered. That something important was happening. That this, too, was a kind of survival. The stories were maps, in their own way. Not of rivers or valleys or stars, but of people, of decisions made, mistakes learned from, dangers remembered. One story might explain why you should never cross a certain mountain in spring, or how to read the wind before a storm. Another might hide a warning inside a tale of laughter, reminding listeners that even joy carries risk, and that the line between safety and danger is often drawn thin. The elders didn't point to morals. They let the meaning rise slowly, like steam from a bowl of hot broth. Each listener took what they needed. Sometimes the same story would be told a different way, depending on who was speaking. The hunt became larger. The winter colder. The laughter louder. But that didn't make it false, it made it alive. Each retelling was a thread added to the tapestry of memory, and in time, the stories became part of the people themselves. You could see it in the way a young hunter paused before stepping on a strange trail. In the way a mother sang a line from a tale while wrapping her child for sleep. These weren't just stories. They were echoes of lived experience, passed down in breath, in tone, in rhythm. Sometimes, the fire would pop loudly, and everyone would glance up, as if the fire itself were responding. The storyteller might pause then, smile faintly, and adjust their voice. Perhaps they'd lean forward. Perhaps they'd lower their tone, make the children lean in closer. In that space between words, magic lived. You could feel the weight of time pressing gently against the present. You could sense the many nights before, the many fires, the many circles, the many generations who had listened just like this. The words felt old, yet fresh. Distant, yet close. And though the stories changed slightly with each telling, some lines remained the same. A phrase that always came before danger. A chant that always followed a victory. A name that always made the listener shiver. These repeating elements were anchors, signals, passwords into the deeper world of shared knowing. And the elders protected these moments with care. They didn't rush. They didn't explain. They simply let the stories unfold, like the slow blooming of a night flower. Some stories were short, just a few sentences long, like a riddle or a spark. Others stretched into the darkness, bending and looping and wandering like a river across memory. There was no script. No pressure to entertain. And yet, everyone was entertained, not in the way we understand it today, but in the deeper sense of being fully present, of being gently carried through another mind's memory. The storyteller's voice was everything, sometimes hushed, sometimes sharp, sometimes full of humor or sorrow or wonder. And in those tones, listeners felt the emotions, the fear of being lost in snow, the thrill of catching a fish bigger than a child, the grief of saying goodbye to someone who would not return. The stories allowed emotions to be shared safely, across time. They made space for awe, for curiosity, for grief. They made the past feel alive, not as something gone, but as something held, something here, still warm from memory, and occasionally, a listener would ask something small, a gesture, a glance, a quiet, "Did that really happen?" The elder might nod, or laugh, or say nothing at all. Because truth, in these stories, wasn't always literal. It was layered. Symbolic. It wasn't just about what happened, but about what it meant. The story of a great bird stealing fire from the sky wasn't about birds or fire. It was about courage. About change. About the risk of doing what no one had done before. And as the listeners grew, as children became adults, they began to understand more. The stories they had heard a dozen times suddenly felt different. The same line hit harder. The same ending carried a deeper weight. That was the gift of these tales, they grew with the listener. And the fire, always the fire, kept them close. Its glow seemed to hold the stories in place, to wrap them in safety, to keep them from flying away into the cold night. Sometimes, after a story ended, there would be silence. Not awkward. Not empty. Just, full. As if the air itself was digesting what had just been said. A few might nod. Someone might poke the fire. A child might fall asleep, the story cradled in their dreams. There was no clapping, no critique, no review. Just the shared understanding that something important had passed between them. A reminder. A lesson. A moment of meaning. And slowly, the night would continue. Another elder might speak. Or someone might hum. Or they might all sit in stillness, listening to the wood crackle, watching the embers pulse like distant stars. In that warmth, wrapped in furs and story, they felt safe. Not just from the cold or the wild, but from forgetting who they were, where they came from, what the world had tried to teach them. Because in those fireside moments, the past wasn't past. It was alive, breathing through the voices of the old, flickering in the eyes of the young. And long before books or archives or carved tablets, this was how knowledge survived. Not through facts, but through feeling. Through voice. Through the long, slow telling of a world remembered. And in those stories, they found more than entertainment. They found direction. Meaning. Identity. And when the fire grew low and the stars rose high and the wind whispered through the trees, they lay down not just to sleep, but to carry the story into dreams. Knowing that someday, when their hair grew thin and their hands slow, they too would speak, not to lecture, but to remember aloud. Before sleep, they always checked the entrance. It didn't matter how calm the day had been or how far away danger had felt. Night was another world, colder, darker, quieter, but also filled with unknown sounds, shifting shadows, and the ancient memory of teeth in the dark. So, just as dusk deepened and the fire gave off its soft orange glow, someone, an elder, a parent, perhaps the one who always took the last watchful lap around camp, would step to the cave's mouth. They would scan the tree line, sniff the wind, and listen closely. Stones were sometimes stacked in small, deliberate patterns. Not tall enough to block anything serious, but enough to slow something down. Sharpened sticks were laid out like warning fingers, and the fire was either fed or moved closer, its warmth not just for comfort, but for protection. The smell of smoke was their shield. The crackling of flame was a reminder to all things wild, this space is taken. Safety, of course, was never certain. Not fully. That was something they all understood. But hope, and preparation, were how they managed the uncertainty. Once the area felt settled, once the fire had steadied and the sounds of night animals became familiar instead of alarming, the people slowly drifted into stillness. There were no separate beds. No pillows or blankets as we know them. Just skins, fur, and stone, and each other. They curled together in small clusters. Parents pulled children in close, arms draped gently across shoulders. Elders leaned into walls, their backs pressed to familiar curves in the rock. Even strangers, when traveling with a group, found space nearby, because closeness was warmth, and warmth was life. Their idea of home was not about furniture or decoration. It was about the cave's embrace, the feeling of stone at your back and fire at your feet. It was about knowing someone was within arm's reach. That if a sound broke the night, you wouldn't face it alone. And so they curled tightly, bodies overlapping like roots in a nest, listening as the last murmurs faded. Maybe a child whispered one last question. Maybe someone chuckled softly at a remembered part of a story. Then the cave filled with quiet breath, the firelight dimmed, and sleep arrived slowly, like mist. Outside, the wolves might pass silently, sniffing the smoke and turning away. The stars wheeled overhead, unseen but present. And within that simple shelter, walls, warmth, and one another, they dreamed not of palaces or riches, but of waking again come morning, alive, together, whole. Sleep came slowly, and it came lightly. There were no heavy blankets to pull over one's head, no locked doors to separate the sleepers from the dark. Instead, there was the thin veil of warmth from the fire, the soft weight of fur across limbs, and the closeness of other breathing bodies. The cave, though sheltering, did not shut out the world. It echoed with it. And the night, vast and always awake, moved around them. The wind crept in through cracks and curled against their skin. The low pop and hiss of the fire marked time. Outside, distant sounds rose and fell like waves, the howl of an unseen creature, the sudden flap of wings in the trees, the quiet scrape of paw or claw against forest floor. But they were used to it. These weren't threats, not always. They were the voices of the wild, the language of the land. The wolves called to each other, but rarely came too close to fire. The deer whispered through the underbrush. The owls spoke in soft, repeated questions. These were the lullabies of the world before walls. Where others might hear danger, they heard familiarity, a rhythm to the darkness that told them life went on beyond the fire's light. The elders, especially, knew each sound. They could name the creatures by their cries. They knew when silence was natural, and when it meant something had changed. Inside, the breathing slowed. One by one, they slipped into sleep. A child might murmur something incomprehensible, fingers twitching in a half-dream. A mother might shift, adjusting her arm beneath a curled-up child. An elder might let out a long, slow sigh, the kind that empties not just the lungs, but the day. And soon, the cave filled only with breath and emberlight. Dreams came quietly. Not loud, flashing dreams like those born in bright cities and restless minds, but slow dreams, shaped by memory, by recent stories, by the crackling of the fire. A mammoth scene once might return in a dream, larger than life. A familiar river might appear, its waters clearer, its fish speaking in riddles. In sleep, they traveled without moving. They revisited old hunts, imagined coming seasons, whispered silently to those they had lost. And through it all, the night passed, watching, listening. The stars turned above. The wind shifted. Animals came and went, unaware or uninterested in the silent humans tucked away in their circle of stone and flame. And still they slept, not deeply, not without interruption, but enough. Enough to heal. Enough to rise again when the first gray light crept into the cave and the birds began their cautious morning songs. For now, though, they rested, safe not because they had conquered the night, but because they had learned to live alongside it. In that fragile stillness, wrapped in fur and dream and quiet, they were as close to peace as their world would allow. Even in sleep, the hunt continued. Not with real spears or breathless chases across stone and snow, but in the gentle landscape of the mind, where memory and desire blended into something half-seen, half-felt. Some dreamed of mammoths, towering and silent, their tusks glowing like moonlight. Others dreamed of the sharp gleam of a saber-toothed eye, or the way its shadow stretched across grass. And not all dreams were of fear or pursuit. Many were gentle, of sunlit meadows they'd once wandered, or rivers that glistened in afternoon warmth. A tree they knew, a berry's taste, the sound of birds spiraling in the sky. Their dreams were not shaped by clocks or screens or the anxieties of tomorrow's schedule. There were no alarms waiting to jolt them into motion. No glowing reminders of things left undone. Sleep came when the fire grew low and the eyes grew heavy, and waking came with the first light, not as an interruption, but as part of a larger rhythm. Their rest was natural, cyclical, and deep. Not always long, but whole in its way. They lay wrapped in furs, shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising like soft fog into the chill air of the cave. And in that shared silence, the brain wandered freely. The elders often said dreams were more than just stories. They were warnings. Guides. Sometimes, even messages from those who had walked the earth before. A vivid dream might be told in the morning with care, listened to by others not with skepticism, but curiosity. What did it mean that someone had dreamed of fire? Of a storm rolling over a mountain? Of a wolf sitting quietly, watching, but not attacking? They didn't dismiss dreams as nonsense or fiction. In a world without written words or formal maps, dreams were another kind of knowledge, fragile, fleeting, and worth paying attention to. They were stitched together not by logic, but by instinct, memory, and imagination. And just as the hunt shaped the body, the dream shaped the heart. Sometimes a child would wake and whisper that they'd seen their grandmother, gone many winters now, walking beside a herd of deer. No one laughed. No one told them it was only a dream. Because in those quiet hours, when the fire was nothing but glowing coals and the stars wheeled unseen above the roof of stone, the difference between real and unreal blurred, softened, and sometimes disappeared. Sleep was not a place they went alone. Even in their dreaming, they were part of something shared, a community not only of people, but of spirits, stories, and symbols. One might dream of a path through the woods and then discover it the next day, as if the dream had come before the waking. Another might see a child yet unborn, and feel a strange peace, carrying that image silently for weeks before speaking it aloud. These weren't seen as coincidences, but as part of life's deeper rhythm. They didn't have a word for subconscious, but they understood that there were layers beneath what was spoken, hidden places in the mind that only the night could open. In that way, sleep wasn't an ending to the day but a different kind of journey. It was where questions lived, where memories breathed more freely, where fears softened just enough to be touched, and where wonders expanded without the weight of survival. There were no deadlines in that world. No to-do lists crowding their thoughts as they settled down. The world outside still moved, yes, the wind still rustled the trees, and predators still prowled, but inside the cave, within the slow curl of sleep, time became something else. It wasn't counted, only felt. A slow drift, a release, a returning. And their bodies, weary but strong, grounded by walking and working and being, welcomed rest without guilt. It was necessary. It was respected. The world had not yet invented the pressure to be productive every hour. Rest was not wasted time. It was healing. It was remembering. It was preparation for another long day under the sky. And in sleep, the body relaxed in a way modern people might barely remember. Muscles softened. Jaws unclenched. Minds, though alert in dreams, no longer held the weight of decisions or plans. They floated instead in scenes shaped by feeling, the warmth of fire, the curve of a riverbank, the sudden laugh of a child, the glow of eyes in the dark, and none of it needed to make sense. Because the mind, like the stars, didn't follow only straight paths. When they stirred, it was not to an alarm, but to birdsong and the slow brightening of the world. The transition from dream to waking was gentle. A murmur from someone nearby, the stretch of a back, the sniff of smoke still rising from coals. They blinked, shifted, took a moment to return. And even then, the dream might linger, sitting quietly behind their thoughts like a soft echo. They might carry it with them all day, trying to remember the color of a sky they'd only seen in sleep. Or the sound of footsteps on ground that didn't exist. And slowly, that dream might become story. And that story might become myth. And that myth might shape a belief that would live for generations. All from one night. One dream. One whisper from the dark. In this way, their dreams weren't just private experiences. They were threads in the larger fabric of their shared life. And even now, so many thousands of years later, we find the faint marks of their sleeping thoughts, in the images they painted, the tales they told, and the choices they made. Because even in a time ruled by survival, there was space for wonder. For deep rest. For dreams. And maybe that's the quiet truth we forget today, that long before we were busy, we were simply alive. Breathing beside fire. Listening to wind. Drifting off to sleep beneath a sky untouched by time. When morning came again, it wasn't loud or jarring. There were no alarms, no shouts, no doors flung open to pull anyone from their sleep. Just a slow return, from the softness of dreams to the coolness of dawn, from the stillness of the night to the gentle stirrings of breath and motion. The fire, now mostly ash and faint embers, glowed dimly in the cave center. Light crept in slowly, not the sharp brightness of modern mornings, but a pale, silver haze that touched the stone walls like a whisper. One by one, the sleepers stirred. A shoulder shifted. A hand rubbed at tired eyes. A child rolled against a parent's chest, seeking warmth. They blinked at the growing light not with annoyance, but with instinct, the same way flowers turn toward the sun without knowing why. There was no rush. No race. Just a quiet understanding that the night had passed and the world was, once again, waiting. They didn't leap to their feet or groan about another day. They simply stretched, arms reaching, backs arching, like creatures who understood their place in the rhythm of the earth. Outside, the birds were already singing. Not loudly, but persistently, small chirps and trills threading through the forest canopy. Leaves rustled as the wind moved through them, soft and cool. Somewhere nearby, the slow splash of a deer stepping into water echoed faintly. The world was awake, but not hurried. Even the animals took their time. And so did the people. Someone stirred the fire, coaxing the embers back into flame. Someone else reached for the dried wood stacked against the wall. There were no conversations at first, just glances, small gestures, shared routines performed wordlessly. The work of waking up wasn't rushed because there was no clock to race against. Morning was not something to conquer, just something to move through. A sip of water from a nearby vessel. A slow rubbing of a tool stone. A few soft coughs, a yawn, the shifting of bodies from sleep to sit, from sit to stand. The children were the last to rise, as they often were. Cradled in the leftover warmth of others, they blinked at the light like tiny animals, dazed but curious. A parent helped them sit upright, combed fingers through their tangled hair, tied a fur more tightly around small shoulders. No one barked orders. No one told them to hurry. The rhythm of the group was self-correcting, shaped not by discipline but by habit, by necessity, by the shared goal of staying alive together. And in that quiet beginning, there was something beautiful, something modern life often forgets. The idea that morning could be enough just as it is. That waking, breathing, stretching, and starting again doesn't have to come with pressure. It can come with peace. Soon, someone wandered outside to check the path. Another looked over the nearby trees for signs, fresh prints in the mud, movement in the distance, changes in the wind. Someone else returned with berries gathered from just beyond the clearing, brushing off dew with their fingers. The day's first food wasn't a feast, but a shared handful, passed hand to hand, or held out for a sleepy child to nibble from. The day was beginning again, as it had countless times before, and as it would for generations to come. Not with grand gestures or great events, but with quiet motion. With patience. With the understanding that life wasn't about spectacle, it was about presence. And that in this simple return from night to day, there was a kind of wisdom deeper than words. And maybe, for a moment, someone looked up, just paused at the mouth of the cave and stared out at the soft sky, where the last of the stars still faded above the trees. They might have thought of a dream they had. Or a story they'd heard last night. Or simply nothing at all, just felt the quiet hum of being alive. The cave behind them, still cool and dim. The forest before them, full of mystery and routine. There would be work ahead, tools to sharpen, paths to walk, food to find. But it didn't need to start just yet. For now, the moment was enough. A deep breath. A soft sigh. A steady beginning. This was their life. And it wasn't epic every day. It wasn't exciting in the way modern stories demand. It was repetitive. Predictable. Humble. But it was also whole. Full of motion and stillness, fear and laughter, silence and connection. They didn't need more than that. Warmth. Walls. Someone nearby. A safe return from the world of dreams. A quiet start to another turn of the sun. That was home. That was enough. Not everything they did made history. In fact, most of it didn't. There were no names carved into stone, no battles etched into legend, no speeches remembered for generations. The days were quiet, and often, they were the same. They cooked when there was food to cook. They walked when they needed to gather or explore. They waited, for animals to pass, for storms to end, for wounds to heal. They mended, not only their tools or furs, but their patience, their small aches, their hopes. Time moved not in sharp bursts, but in a slow, continuous thread. There were no headlines, no urgent calls to action. Just mornings that arrived in silence and evenings that faded into firelight. The rhythm of their lives was measured in footsteps, in heartbeats, in the hush between stories. A successful day didn't end with applause. It ended with warmth, safety, and another night survived. And maybe that's what we forget when we think of the past, that history is not only made of kings, wars, inventions, or revolutions. Sometimes it's just being. Just living. Just existing in the space between the spectacular. They did not think in centuries. They thought in seasons. In cycles. In the return of berries on the hill, or the first snowfall creeping over the mountain's edge. They noticed change in the way the wind felt on their faces, or how long the sun stayed in the sky. Time didn't tick. It breathed. It rustled. It glowed. And within that steady breathing, they repeated what worked. What kept them alive. They scraped hides, shaped stones, watched children, watched the horizon. They told the same stories more than once. They followed the same trails, year after year. And some might think that sounds boring, predictable, even dull. But there was peace in it, too. There was safety in knowing what came next. There was comfort in the shared work, in the soft murmur of a group sharpening tools together or weaving furs side by side. There was no prize at the end of each day, but also no punishment for quietude. Some days were full. Some were slow. Most passed in a kind of in-between, where not much happened, and yet everything was happening all the time. A child learned how to hold a stone a little better. A hunter noticed a new break in the trees that could mean a fresh trail. Someone hummed a new melody while mashing roots. These were not moments that would ever appear in a museum or textbook, but they were real. They were life. And life, more often than not, is made of the things we forget to notice. The small gestures. The daily repetitions. The quiet that holds it all together. The early humans may not have understood the concept of history, but they lived it. In every meal cooked, every fire lit, every shelter repaired, they carved invisible lines into the earth's memory. They left behind more than artifacts. They left behind a way of being. A way that said, presence matters. Simplicity matters. You don't have to chase greatness to be part of the great story. Sometimes, breathing is enough. Sometimes, sharing a silent moment by the fire is enough. Sometimes, waking up and doing the same thing again, fetching water, walking a familiar path, watching the sky for signs, is enough. They didn't see these acts as tedious or unremarkable. They were simply necessary. And in that necessity was a quiet kind of grace. A rhythm that we, in all our noise and speed, often long for without realizing it. Because today, we fill our days with alerts, with urgency, with noise that tells us we must do more, be more, move faster. But they moved slowly, not because they lacked ambition, but because they moved with the world, not against it. They paused when they needed to. They rested when the body asked. They spoke when words mattered. They sat in silence when they didn't. Their lives were not empty because they lacked drama. They were full in a different way, full of patterns, of meaning, of connection. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what we miss when we try to make every moment count in a measurable way. That sometimes, being still is its own kind of story. That sometimes, doing something simple for the 100th time is not a failure of imagination, but a celebration of continuity. So no, not everything they did made history. Not everything they touched became a legend. Most of their days faded into the soil, the wind, the sky. But their presence remains, in the quiet bones we find, in the fire pits still blackened with soot, in the worn edges of tools that once shaped survival. And perhaps most of all, they remain in us. In the part of us that longs for silence after a long day. In the instinct that watches the weather, or listens to the forest, or smiles at the smell of smoke. They remind us that we come from people who didn't need to be remarkable to matter. People who lived simply, and in doing so, endured. So the next time you feel like your day has been uneventful, that you've done nothing worth remembering, think of them. Think of the thousands of lives lived in quiet repetition, each one a thread in the fabric that brought us here. They didn't need to make history. They were already part of it. And so are you, though we live in towers now, surrounded by screens and endless noise, a small part of us still remembers the cave, the glow of the fire, the hush of the stars, the quiet rhythm of being. We've moved far, but not so far that those ancient nights are lost. They live in us still, beneath the surface, in the way we seek warmth, in the comfort of silence, in the simple need to be near others. Our ancestors didn't chase greatness every day. Most days, they simply existed, and that was enough. So tonight, as you drift off, let go of the rush. Imagine the soft crackle of firelight, the calm breath of a sleeping group, the slow return of dawn. Not thrilling. Not boring. Just steady. Just human. Just like the beginning of everything.